We want to talk about the geopolitical environment and where we're heading. And that's, these days, not such a fun conversation. I'm going to do my best to make it reasonably upbeat. I want to start with the idea that being in what I call a geopolitical recession, a down cycle, not forever, comes when you have misalignment between the balance of power in the world and the institutions, the architecture, the values and priorities that have controlled it. There are three ways right now that we see that misalignment playing out, and all of them are challenging globalization. They're all creating some of the crises that we see in our headlines around the world and in this region today. The first is that the Russians are in serious structural decline, and they have not been integrated by the West into their markets, into their politics, and they're angry about it. Number two, China's rise has been extraordinary, and surprisingly to the United States, they have not become Americans. They've become wealthy and powerful, but they are still Chinese. And number three, there are a lot of people that have been left behind in middle classes. In middle classes in the advanced industrial economies because of global trade flows, and increasingly in middle classes in the developing world because of technology transfers, because of the pandemic, and because of the Russian war. And all of that creates a lot of anger for people saying, we don't like the way this old global order is functioning. Three big geopolitical challenges, all misaligned with our institutions and our architecture, and all creating crises. Now, the good news, I promise you good news, right to start, is that those crises create the seeds of a new order. They lead to the reform and strengthening of institutions that were eroding, or if they are inadequate, they lead to the creation of new institutions. But to get from here to there is messy. It's uncomfortable, and it can have a lot of conflict. Let me talk about all three of these challenges as we see them playing out geopolitically beyond 2023. The three fundamental geopolitical challenges to globalization. All of them have created structural changes that are permanent, but all of them are also more contained than you would think from the media and from the headlines. Number one, the Russian war. And of course, what we see playing out in Russia right now is a decoupling, the first ever, of a G20 economy, about 2% of global GDP, from the West, from the United States, from Europe, from Japan, South Korea, from all the advanced industrial democracies. That's permanent. It won't change. I don't know what's going to happen in Ukraine. I recognize that the Ukrainians can lose this war. Lord knows President Zelensky knows he can lose. That's why 5 hours after he gets the tanks, he says, where are the F-16s? Because he sees that time is not on his side and that there is an existential threat to his country if he doesn't continue to get strong support. But Russia cannot win. They might be able to hold territory in Ukraine, but they cannot win on the global stage because NATO will expand. Thousands of troops will be forward deployed. Expenditure on defense for the US, for the Europeans, for Japan will be massively greater than it was before. Gas pipelines are not going to be reopened or rebuilt going from Europe to Russia. The assets that have been frozen by the Europeans, by the Japanese, are not going to be unfrozen. And so as a consequence, we have a very deep challenge where the Russians have been made into the most powerful rogue state that we've ever experienced. And the potential for asymmetrical conflict, especially facing NATO, is very high accordingly. Now, I said all three of these would be contained. The containment is that we're talking about the West. We're not talking about the rest of the world. Here, both in the Emirates and in the Middle East, there is not an effort to decouple the Russians. There's just as much coordination on OPEC Plus as there was before. In China, just as much business with the Russians. In India, a lot more business with the Russians than there was before. Indeed, what we're seeing is a level of anger coming from the developing world. They see $100 billion being spent on the Ukrainians, which even in Dubai feels like real money. And at the same time, they look at the $100 billion that was promised by the wealthy countries to the poorest in the world to respond to climate change, still hasn't been made. They see white Europeans getting $100 billion, but what about the Palestinians? What about Ethiopia? What about Sudan? What about Yemen? What about any of these countries? And the answer is not so interesting. And as a consequence, you see an enormous gap between what the United States and allies are doing and what everyone else is doing. That was number one. Number two, the United States and China. There is a true structural change away from globalization. We see it in any technology that is considered to be critical to national security of either country. They used to integrate, they're now separating them. We see it with Huawei and 5G. We see it with semiconductors at a high level. We see it with quantum computing, with generative AI, and others. The U.S. will enforce export controls, and core American allies, we've already seen South Korea, Japan, the Netherlands will get on board. The Chinese, last week, reacted with their own export controls. They said, for critical minerals processing, where the Chinese have the lead, or looking at solar cell production, where the Chinese are dominant globally, and some aspects of biotech, they are decoupling. They are putting in export controls. They want to take that lead. That's pretty serious since we're talking about the two largest economies in the world that are probably going to change places by 2030. But there's also a constraint, which is that we're not talking about ending interdependence between these two countries, not at all. Just last week, we saw that the United States and China have record levels of trade between each other. I mean, that's not a Cold War. That's a floor on the U.S.-China relationship. We see that other countries around the world want to be more aligned with the Americans on security, and they want to do more business with the Chinese economically at the same time. And I'm not just talking about the Europeans, I'm even talking about the Japanese and the South Koreans who are right there in front of China militarily. Those leaders will tell you that. And even the United States, I just heard the minister ask Elon Musk, was it aliens? I can tell you that as for the balloon, the United States knew about that balloon for a couple days before it was public. And Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, was still being sent to Beijing, was still going to meet with Xi Jinping. And you know what that means? That means the chances that the Americans were going to shoot down that balloon were zero. None. It would not happen until it became public, and then the politics got in the way, and then they had to cancel the trip, and then they had to shoot down the balloon and anything else they find above American skies, right? But this should give you a level of comfort that the intention was not to blow up the relationship. It was just that Pelosi trip, the former speaker to Taiwan. Biden didn't want it to happen, was pressuring her, it became public, then they had to go. But what we're seeing, I'm going to Munich right after this event, as are several of the people that have been speaking here, and I fully expect that the Secretary of State is going to meet with State Councilor Wang Yi on the sidelines. Why? They want to maintain that relationship. So the level of decoupling between the United States and China is overstated. The end of globalization is overstated. We should not panic on the basis of the confrontation, which is true, which is real, which is sharp competition, but it is not the end of the interdependence. Okay, number 3, and that's all of this nationalism, all the protectionism we see around the world. My country's been doing it. Donald Trump said, America first. Now, that is not meant to appeal to people outside the U.S. And Biden said a U.S. foreign policy for the American middle class, also not meant to appeal to people outside the U.S. And that's not just the Americans. We see the Europeans with their subsidies, with their focus on local labor. We see the developing world doing the same thing. Industrial policy. We had OPEC in this region, we still do. Now we see an OPEC being developed for lithium as we transition to post-carbon. Of course we do. But these are incremental steps. These are steps that will put sand in the gears of global growth. They will make it harder to have supply chains that are just in time, but they are absolutely not governments, either the Americans, the Europeans, or the developing world, saying we want to end our global trade patterns. We want to bring everything in-house. They are small and incremental changes. So those are the 3 big things that I see happening geopolitically that are going to affect the global order for the next 10 years. None of them should be welcomed by people that are market participants. They are all challenges. We shouldn't like them. They're politics that are interfering with all of us doing business. But none of them are the end of globalization. It's globalization adrift, it's globalization constrained, but it's also globalization continuing. And I think that's really critical. A few takeaways from that. The EU will be politically stronger in a more challenging environment, economically and from a security perspective. You will see the EU with stronger energy policy, fiscal policy, health policy, defense policy, and tech policy than at any point since the EU was created. Because of these crises, because of the geopolitical concerns, because of the pandemic, heck, because of Brexit. We see NATO stronger too. But that's not so different from the GCC becoming stronger and more aligned as we realize that the United States is playing less of a role as global policeman right here, is less interested in maintaining the same consistent and strong relationship that the U.S. had had for decades. That's not a shock to anybody in this room. The one big challenge in that environment will be a bigger gap between West and South. We'll see that in response to the pandemic. We see it in response to climate change, and we're seeing it in response to creeping protectionism. I think that's structural. It's not clear how China plays in that environment, in part because the biggest uncertainty in terms of country trajectory for the next 10 years is, will China be successful as they have been? Their headwinds are growing. No one has accomplished on the global stage what China has for the last 50 years. But you probably know that China's demographics are the worst going forward of any country in peacetime, any major economy. Their total population peaked last year. Working age population peaked 6 years ago. Unsustainable, corporate debt that is non-performing, challenges with productivity, and increasingly a Chinese leader that has consolidated control and gets less information from people around him with differing opinions. That is how we shifted from zero COVID to everyone gets COVID, which we welcome because it means that China's growing again this year, but which we don't welcome because the implementation of the policy was much less thought through than what we are used to dealing with from China over the past couple of decades. That is the big uncertainty. Less about their alignment, more about their ability to perform and execute. That's a big open question. Now, I want to take a shift before we close. I've got a little less than 10 minutes. I've been talking about the geopolitical order traditionally. I've talked about states and how they do and they don't align. I haven't spoken about technology. And since we just started today with the most important transformational technologist on the global stage, I should probably address the implications of technology for our future geopolitical order. And there are a couple of things I want to mention here. The first is that when I started as a political scientist, the role of technology was all about the communication revolution. It was empowering individuals with information. On balance, that was strengthening open societies, and it undermined closed societies. Open societies that are democracies, like the United States and Japan. Open societies that are not democracies, like Singapore and the Emirates. It undermined closed societies, like Russia, like China, heck, like Egypt. And we saw, whether it was the colored revolution or whether it was the Arab Spring, that there was significant challenge as a consequence of the ability of individuals through their smartphones, through their computers, to have access to information that the government wasn't comfortable with. That's changed. And in the course of just a couple of decades, we are now talking not about the communication revolution, but the surveillance revolution, the data revolution, top down. We're talking about social media and algorithms that we're not comfortable with our kids being on. We shouldn't be comfortable with how much time we're on it. What we have seen over the course of just 30 years is the United States, my country, has gone from being the principal exporter of democracy, sometimes with hypocrisy, sometimes unsuccessfully, but still that's how the wall came down. Today, the United States has become the principal exporter of tools that destroy democracy. Not intentionally. It just happens to be an indirect implication of the business models that drive these sovereign technological platforms that we're all on. And by the way, we're not talking about the US government. We're talking about technology companies. So here I am giving you a talk about geopolitics, and yet when we move to technology, we talk less about governments and we talk more about companies. That's an extraordinary transformation that none of us are really prepared for. So we just had Elon on stage. I have to tell you, I think there's a good chance that if it isn't for Elon Musk, and if it isn't for Satya Nadella, there's a good chance that Volodymyr Zelensky is not in power today. I think that they did more at the beginning to ensure he stayed in power and that the Russians were prevented from taking over his country than anybody else, than any other country. I'm talking about the protection of Ukraine in terms of their cloud and from cyber attacks from Russia. And I'm also talking about the ability of the Ukrainians to engage in conversations with their military leadership and fight, despite the efforts of one of the largest militaries in the world to shut them down. I think that's extraordinary. But I also understand that the decision of whether or not to make that intervention was made by two people, two individuals who could have made a different decision and who probably would make different decisions if we were talking about different countries. Maybe if we were talking about Taiwan, anywhere around the world. I think the fact that we are now living in a world that is increasingly not unipolar, like the old security order, not multipolar, like the emerging economic order, but technopolar. A world where in the virtual space, in the digital world, power and control is in the sovereign hands of individuals largely in the private sector. And they have not yet decided what kind of a geopolitical model they want in the world. Do they want to be aligned with governments? And if so, which ones? Will we live in a world of national champions? Will we live in a world where tech companies will be the 21st century equivalent of Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman? Or will we live in a world where technology companies are just like every other company historically in the private sector, separate from governments, lobbying for better regulations for themselves, wanting to pay less tax, but not really wanting to play a political role at all? And so the government is dominant in the physical space, and the technology companies are dominant in the digital space, and we have to navigate that. Or are we in an environment where the virtual world becomes dominant, where the digital order becomes how we interact for our security, for our economy, and for our country's governance? When we were kids, to the extent that we grew up the way we did, it was either because of our family or our genetics, nature or nurture, our community or our parents. Everything screwed up about me, you can pretty much find in one of those two places. But today, increasingly, we are talking about nature, nurture, and algorithm. And young people today, I would argue, are at least as influenced by algorithm in what they believe, what they think is true, who they connect with, what they buy, what they prefer politically, and the future of their security. Their personal security, their company's security, and their country's, their nation's security. That is an extraordinary shift. And all of that will be made exponentially more important by artificial intelligence. I'm a huge advocate for AI. I really believe in what it will do for our planet. For decades, we've been talking about access to information and ending the digital divide so that everyone on the planet could learn things. Today, everyone online will have access to operational intelligence. And the productivity gains that we will see as a consequence of that, I think, are unheralded in anything the world had experienced through the age of globalization. This will be a new age of AI beyond globalization. But there is a dangerous downside. And that is, as the digital divide ends, there are many things that most of us will know that are just not so. And the danger of having operational intelligence and not knowing what is true, or believing certain things that are fundamentally false about your leaders, your institutions, your governance, and the planet, is also a set of tools that are incredibly dangerous in the wrong hands. And so far, our governments have very little capability or willingness to regulate them. In other words, this conversation we're having this morning is absolutely critical for the future of our geopolitical order. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I wish you a great summit.